The gentleman you're about to meet is the chief architect of a game-changing, science-based 50-state plan to power life in America as we know it, solely with electricity generated by wind, water, and the sun. This groundbreaking methodology and technology behind the plan is being applied in over 120 countries worldwide. And that number may be greater. Mark will let us know. Interestingly, this gentleman's passion for climate science dates back to when he went to Los Angeles as a teenager with his tennis team. And when he noticed, what he noticed at the time was the smog. It smelled foul. It hung in the air like poison. And it made it difficult to breathe when he was chasing tennis balls. He asked himself, why should anyone live like this? Isn't there a solution to this problem? This is a teenager playing tennis. That concerned young tennis player went on to become a Stanford University professor at the age of 29. In 2019, he received Stanford's prestigious Judy Friedman Life Achievement Award. He also was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world in climate policy. And that accolade came from Apolitical, a global learning platform used by public servants in 160 countries worldwide. The story of how he and his team created this remarkable roadmap for America and by extension the world to follow is at the heart of a new documentary film called 100% Possible, The Battle for America's Energy Future. And that film will go into production later this year. Here's a brief teaser for the film.
The truth is that we can do this. We are technologically poised to do it.
There's enough wind to power the entire world for all purposes around 7 times over, and solar about 30 times over. We calculate 22 million new jobs worldwide by such a transition.
Wherever the wind turbines are at, it benefits the whole community.
Most people think, God, you're insane. Except I get to help the environment. I get to feel like I'm actually contributing.
Is to convert it 100% by 2050.
We actually have a chance of making this thing happen.
The world is waking up, and change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stanford University professor, Dr. Mark Jacobson.
Hey, thank you so much, Cort, for that kind introduction, and everybody else here. helped organize this event. And yeah, that's really inspiring just to watch the teaser of that video. I'm looking forward to it. But I'm here to talk about same subject, which is how to transition cities, states, countries, and the world entirely to clean renewable energy, namely wind and water and solar and storage for everything. And the reason I've been interested, as Cort mentioned, I mean, it started as looking at air pollution and trying to solve that problem. First I tried to understand the problem and then come up with solutions, because it's really hard to come up with good solutions if you don't really understand the problem. So I spent many years studying and modeling air pollution and also climate, building a climate model from scratch. And climate is intricately related to air pollution. Air pollution affects climate and climate affects air pollution. And so I looked at those issues and I still look at them, but the first 20 years of my career after university. But then, over the last 20 years, I also started looking at solutions to these problems, and what are the most efficient ways to eliminate the 7 million air pollution deaths that occur each year worldwide from fossil fuels and biofuels, how to slow and reverse global warming most efficiently, and also provide energy security. So the answer, and really the first study that we did looking at this comprehensively with Mark DeLuca, who's at UC Berkeley now, but was at UC Davis at the time. We did 10 years ago, well, in 2000, actually more than 10 years ago now, in November 2009, in Scientific American, we looked to repower the entire world with just wind and water and solar. And the answer was, well, yes, it's technically and economically possible to do that even by 2030. And that's actually turned out to be the basis. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the basis for the Green New Deal proposals, the 2030 deadline, and going to 100% clean renewable energy for everything. But from a practical point of view, it was unlikely that we can get overcomes political and social barriers by then. So we've subsequently modified that to suggest, well, we should get 80% by 2030 and 100% no later than 2050, ideally earlier, maybe 2040, 2035. But as fast as possible, really. But in order to avoid 1.5 degree global warming since pre-industrial, really since the early 1900s, we really need 80% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And that's across all energy sectors. So what's kind of the idea here? Well, the idea of all these plans, and I'll kind of summarize that first, and then I'm going to go from large scale to small scale back to large scale. The idea is to electrify or provide direct heat for everything, and provide that electricity and heat with entirely clean renewable energy, namely wind and water and solar power. So for example, for transportation, we use battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, and battery electric for all short distance and medium distance transportation, but heavy long distance transportation like heavy long distance aircrafts, long distance ships, some long distance trains, we use hydrogen fuel cells, and even long distance trucks over 1,000 kilometer range. But everything shorter than that, we can use batteries. And the hydrogen would be produced from wind, water, and solar power, electricity from wind, water, and solar power. For heating and cooling, we'd move everything to heat pumps that run on electricity. Heat pumps are advantageous because they move heat and cold from place to place. They don't actually create heat or cold. So they use like 1/4 to 1/5 the energy as a natural gas heater or even electric resistance heater. So they're much cheaper in terms of their energy consumption and their energy costs. Some solar hot water preheating, some geothermal direct heating, and then using district heating and cooling for high density urban areas. That would be more efficient. And then for industry, we would electrify all high temperature industrial processes. And there are existing technologies to do that. There are arc furnaces, induction furnaces, resistance furnaces, dielectric heaters, electron beam heaters. These are all existing technologies that can run on electricity instead of on fossil fuels, where if the electricity were provided with clean renewable sources. And then the electricity itself would be provided by onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, that's CSP, geothermal power, hydroelectric, most of it is existing today, and tidal wave power. So this is basically, that's the generation portion of an entirely clean, renewable energy system and some of the appliances and machines that are needed. What about, well, let me just give some examples of some of these technologies that you're all familiar with. Well, you're mostly familiar with wind turbines, which take the kinetic energy from the wind and convert it to electricity. They don't require a lot of land, as you can see. There is land, they occupy land, there is a spacing area between wind turbines, but the actual footprint on the ground is pretty small. As you can see, they don't take up much land area, and you can use the land in between for multiple purposes like farming and rangeland and grassland and other things. And offshore, it's mostly water. So offshore, the nice thing is there are floating turbines that are now commercially available. And the benefit of floating turbines is now wind turbines can be sited much further offshore, and that reduces their objections by people living along the coast. And there are enormous wind resources offshore. In the United States, there's enough wind resource off the east and west coast to power pretty much the entire United States. So once in Europe, there's already a big boom of offshore wind turbines, and in Asia as well. But once we really go gung-ho with offshore wind, then you'll see a much more rapid transition to clean renewable energy in the US. I mean, right now, as of this year, there's about 22% of all US electricity is from wind and water and solar power. And that's grown quite a bit in the last 5 years, but it will grow much faster if we move to more offshore wind, which hopefully there are a bunch of proposals for offshore wind that are ready to be approved, but they've been slow to be approved recently. So let's look at some solar photovoltaics. They can pretty much go anywhere. You can see them here on a canal, on water, on commercial buildings, and in the desert. And kind of the larger the array of photovoltaics, the cheaper it is. So solar PV in deserts right now, it's about half the cost of natural gas. And onshore wind is also half the cost of natural gas in many places. So these onshore wind and utility solar photovoltaics are really the cheapest forms of electricity in the world right now. And this is good news because the technologies are still being improved and the cost can come down even more. But you might think, well, solar is only good in low latitudes. However, most people don't realize that the location on the Earth with the highest annual amount of solar radiation, if you're actually tracking the sun with a solar panel, is the Antarctic. There's actually more solar radiation if you put a solar panel on the top of at the South Pole, on the top of the mountain at the South Pole. You'll get more solar radiation there than anywhere else on Earth in the annual average. Of course, you'll have 3 months of no sunlight at all. But my point is, if you can store that solar electricity as either heat or as electricity, when you need it, solar is actually very valuable at high latitudes. Now, for transportation, there's been a lot of progress. There are now semi-trucks. So for example, Tesla has a truck that is electric that can go 850 kilometers. Nikola also has an electric truck, but they also have a hydrogen fuel cell truck that goes up to 1,200 kilometers. And so this is really good because now these trucks are a source of not only CO2, but also black carbon, the main component of soot, black carbon is really the second leading cause of global warming after carbon dioxide. And it's a major cause of air pollution health problems. So by replacing trucks with diesel trucks with electric or hydrogen fuel cell trucks, you're really eliminating street pollution that not only causes lots of death worldwide, but also contributes substantially to global warming through the particles alone. There are also now electric ships and ferries being built. On the bottom left is an electric ferry that exists now. And on the bottom right is an electric bus. And there are now hundreds of thousands of electric buses that have been built worldwide. Aircraft will probably be the last form of transportation to be transitioned. On the left is a small electric aircraft. On the bottom right is a small hydrogen fuel cell aircraft that can seat 4 people and travel 1,500 kilometers. And on the top right is a drawing for a cryogenic hydrogen aircraft. Cryogenic hydrogen is just hydrogen where the hydrogen gas has been compressed to to high pressure and low temperature. And so it's actually more dense than if it's much more dense than if it's a gas. And anyway, it'll still take more volume. So a hydrogen fuel cell aircraft or even a hydrogen combustion aircraft, and we prefer hydrogen fuel cell, would require larger volume, but it would actually weigh less than a jet fuel aircraft. And so the overall drag should be somewhat similar. Okay, so for storage, for a 100% clean renewable energy system, we'll need electricity storage, heat and cold storage, and also hydrogen storage. So electricity storage, concentrated solar power, well, CSP is really where you have, it's usually in deserts where you have a central tower that contains a fluid, and you have a bunch of mirrors, usually in a circle around the tower, focusing light from the sun onto the mirror, onto the tower to heat the fluid. And you get the fluid up to a high temperature, and that fluid then gets stored in a tank, and it can be stored overnight. And when it's stored overnight, then you can use it overnight to create electricity by boiling water, and the steam from the water runs a steam turbine to generate electricity. Excuse me. So that's one type of technology that's already existing, and it's low-cost storage. Pumped hydroelectric is the most common type of storage that exists in the United States today. And that is, and also worldwide, that's where you have two reservoirs, a lower and an upper. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to take some water. This happens sometimes when I talk and it gets dry. So pumped hydro, you have two reservoirs, a lower and an upper one. When you have excess electricity, you use it to pump water up a hill. And then when you need the electricity, you let water drain down the hill and run a turbine to produce electricity. Then there's existing hydroelectric dams, which are basically big batteries. They can turn on and off within a few seconds. And so you can generate electricity on demand. And then batteries themselves, flywheels, which are very short-term storage. Compressed air storage is, you can either have compressed air by where you can store the air in a cavern, which was, there are not that many caverns underground that you can store air and compress it. But you can also have a tank where you, when you have excess electricity, you can compress the air. And then when you need electricity, you let the air expand and to create electricity. Then there's gravitational storage by solid masses, and I'll show you examples of that in a minute. And then for heating, cooling, there's water tank storage, ice storage. So water tank is very common, where you have just a hot water tank and a cold water tank, and you can just store, you can either heat water in the tank or send hot water to a tank, store it for a while. There's ice storage, I'll show you an example of that. And then there's underground storage in boreholes, water pits, and aquifers. And I'll show you some examples of those in a minute. And then building materials. And then finally, hydrogen storage, because we'll need some hydrogen, particularly for transportation, but also for some industry as well. So let's look at some of these examples. Here's gravitational storage with solid masses. On the left, you see when you have excess electricity, let's say from wind, the wind is very intermittent, so the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine for solar. But when you have excess electricity, you can use that to power a motor to lift up a concrete block. And then when you need the electricity, you lower the concrete block, and the motor runs in reverse as a generator to generate electricity. And the same thing on the right is where you have, let's say, a train that's filled with blocks or concrete or rocks. And then when you have excess electricity, you push the train up the hill, and when you need electricity, you let the train roll down the hill and power a generator to produce electricity. So this is an example of district heating. And this is actually at Stanford where I work. Stanford used to have a natural gas cogeneration plant until about 4 years ago, and that was bulldozed and replaced with this district heating system where there are two chillers and a boiler. So two cold water tanks and a hot water tank, and hundreds of miles of pipes going through the university, transferring heat and cold to buildings and for air conditioning and for domestic hot and cold water. And this basically, this is powered, well, the heat pumps will provide heat for the boiler and cold water for the chiller. And the heat pumps run on electricity. The university also bought 120 megawatts of solar photovoltaics. So they bought two power plants in desert areas, and then they also have 10 megawatts on rooftops at the university. So the second power plant is going to be completed either early, or maybe later this year or early next year. And when that happens, the university will be the first campus in the world that will be 100% renewable for electricity, heat, and cooling together. And so it just has to get to transportation. But this is really nice. It's when you have like a campus or a high density area, you can use this kind of district heating where instead of heating individual buildings with individual heat pumps, you can actually pipe hot water to buildings with a centralized heater, and that can be more efficient if it's done correctly. But some places, especially if you have more distant areas that are further apart, that is more difficult or more expensive. Okay, so another type, this is also a district heating system, but this is an underground thermal energy storage system that's also called a seasonal storage system that's in Okotoks, Canada, which is 1 hour south of Calgary. So in 2004 and 5, there were 52 homes built with solar collectors on the garages. You can see those in the top left. And in the solar collectors is a glycol solution. So during the summer when the days are long, that glycol solution gets heated and gets piped to this building on the right, where the heat gets transferred to water. The water then is piped under this field, which had been excavated and boreholes were drilled down to 30 meters, and these U-shaped pipes were put in. So the hot water goes down and the heat gets transferred to the soil. And then cold water comes up the other side of the pipe and gets transferred back to the building to cool the glycol solution that gets sent back to the roof, and the whole thing continues working. So that heat in the soil stays for 6 months, and the soil gets heated up to 80 degrees Celsius down below, but the soil top and the grass is not hot. In fact, it's a play field for this community, and you can't even tell there's anything under it. But in the winter, when the snow is on the ground, like on the left, the whole system is run in reverse, and that heat from the soil provides 100% of the heating for these 52 homes. And while batteries cost around $200 a kilowatt hour now, the heating portion, or the energy storage portion of this costs less than $1 per kilowatt hour for the seasonal heat storage. Of course, that's kilowatt hour of heat rather than of electricity. Now, there's a similar type of technology. It's called water pit storage. And this is more common in Europe, where you have a water pit that's semi-underground and sometimes raised a little bit above the ground. Looks like a big swimming pool, like on the left. And you fill that with water and cover it with insulation. And then you have these solar collectors that heat water, and the hot water gets sent to the big pool. And that water gets up to about 80 degrees Celsius. Again, the heat is stored until winter, but it's also used other times of the year. And in this case, this hot water system provides heat for about 2,500 homes in this town. And again, the cost is less than $1 a kilowatt hour for the storage system. Now, another type of storage is ice storage. And in fact, Stanford had a ice cube under a building since 1998. And when electricity prices were low at night, the electricity was used to produce ice. And then during the day, instead of running air conditioning when the electricity price was high, water was sent through coils in the ice to cool the water, and the water was piped to buildings, and the buildings were cooled with this cold water system. And so this ice storage is effectively electricity storage because it avoids the use of electricity, but it costs about 1/10 to 1/20 the cost of battery storage at the time. And so it was actually a very efficient type of battery storage, but because it's much cheaper. And this could be used not only at universities, but also at stadiums and hospitals, and it's used quite a bit in many applications. Let me move from looking at those storage systems to go to an individual building. So I want to talk about transitioning residential home. And in this case, I'm talking about my own home because I have some examples from there. And so my own home I completed in 2017, and there was no gas on the property. It's all solar and batteries and heat pumps. So it runs all on electricity, and I have electric cars. And so I want to describe this. So there's 13.6 kilowatts of solar on the roof. There are 4 Tesla wall mount batteries, although I'm only using 2. The other 2 are just sitting there in reserve for an esoteric reason that the utility didn't want to turn them on. But they can still be used in an emergency or when the other 2 run it, kind of lose their ability to function really well. But I'm only using 2. And then for heating and cooling, I have what are called ductless mini split electric heat pump air heaters and air conditioners. So there's 2 outside units, like on the right here, that's one of the outside units that really exchange heat with the outside air and cold with the outside air. And then there's an indoor unit, like on the left, in each room of the house. And this indoor unit, and then there are no ducts, that's why it's called ductless. There is just coolant, there are tubes connecting the indoor and outdoor units with small tubes that have some coolant. And basically you're moving heat and cold between the outside and the inside, you're not creating heat or cold. So they're on 24 hours a day, but they're just, because the temperature doesn't change rapidly, they're hardly used at all. And they use like 1/4 the energy as a gas heater, as I mentioned. So they are extremely efficient. I've used them for 3 years now, and the temperature is perfect all year in the house, everywhere. I couldn't have asked for a better, more efficient heating system and cooling system, and I'll show you the cost of this in a little bit. For water, I also have a heat pump water heater. In this case, the heat is extracted from the air in a mechanical room. You can see the vents where the heat is taken from the air. And then through a combination of compressors and coolant, that heat is then moved to the water and heats the water up to normal boiling temperature. It could be boiling very hot, very high temperatures that you need. And so again, it's uses only 1/4 the energy as a gas water heater. So it's very efficient. For a stove, instead of a gas stove or even electric resistant stove, I have an electric induction cooktop. And these are really nice because they boil water in half the time as natural gas. They run by their electric currents. Well, you need a pot that has an iron or stainless steel base, and you have an electric current from the stove that basically induces, there's a resistance that occurs at the base of the pot that heats the pot. And as a result, the stove doesn't get hot, only the pot gets hot. There is some conduction of heat back to the stove, but like you can touch the stove when you're boiling water and you won't burn your fingers. So that's a nice thing. It's safe and it cooks very evenly. As I mentioned, you can control the heat very rapidly and it boils water very quickly. So there's really little downside to that. Oh, and I should point out, like on the left here is a single burner of an induction cooktop. So you can imagine, like I mentioned, there are 7 million air pollution deaths worldwide each year. Well, of those, around 3 to 4 million are due to indoor burning of biomass and coal, mostly in developing countries. And part of the reason is there's a burning of biomass and coal, and that creates indoor air pollution. But if you had, let's say, one of these induction burners instead, and powered by 1 or 2 solar panels, then that could significantly reduce air pollution mortalities in developing countries in particular. So this is something that I strongly advocate for because air pollution mortality is the second leading cause of death worldwide, and there are basic solutions that can eliminate a lot of these deaths, and this induction cooktop is one of those. So if we go next to cost, so I've had the home now, I've been using it for over 3 years, and I have a utility. Well, my underlying utility is Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, but the generation portion of the bill was taken over by a community choice aggregation utility called Silicon Valley Clean Energy. And they can either, let's say you don't have solar on your roof, they can procure for you 100% renewable energy because they do power purchase agreements for wind and solar and geothermal and hydro. And so they do have a tariff that for 100% renewables, that so even if you don't have solar on your roof, you can get 100% renewables at a cost that's almost identical to the cost of just regular grid electricity in California. And there are 7 states with these community choice aggregation utilities. Now, because I generate my own solar, I have my own solar, I can also sell back to Silicon Valley Clean Energy basically at the same price at the time of day as they would sell me the electricity. So that's time of use pricing. And so over the last 3 years, on average, it generated 120% of all my home and vehicle energy use. And so that's it's really 2.5 electric vehicles, because my son has an electric car. He charges there too. And so all household use. And as I mentioned, there's no natural gas in the property. So everything in the house I'm still producing more solar electricity that I'm using. And I send that extra 20% back to the grid and sell it. And over the last 3 years, I've received an average of $700 per year back for the excess electricity. And I've had no natural gas bill, no electric bill, or gasoline bill. So there are other advantages besides saving in your annual costs of $1,000 to $3,000 or $4,000 per year for your typical household. You can avoid a gas hookup fee, which in my case would have been about $6,000 to hook up gas from the sidewalk to my property. But the range for that is on the order of $3,000 to $8,000 for the hookup fee. You avoid gas pipes, which could be anywhere from $1,000 to $7,000 or more. But so if you total this up, that's a $4,000 to $15,000 upfront savings plus $3,000 to $10,000 per year savings. Now, without subsidy, the whole system would pay itself all off in about 10 years. Now, with subsidy, because there are subsidies in California and also the federal government, it's about 5-year payback time. And given that solar panels are warranted for 25 years, this is definitely a deal. Anybody who can do it should do it. But as I mentioned, even if you're in an apartment where if you want to get 100% renewable electricity, you can do that through the community choice aggregation utility if that's available in your state. Okay, so let's then transition to worldwide. Can we power each of 143 countries? And I mentioned that number because we developed plans for 143 countries that represent 99.7% of all world emissions. And that's because we had data for those countries. The other countries we didn't have data for. And we looked at, was it possible to transition each country in isolation with 100% renewables? And then we looked at, could we keep the grid stable if we either had the countries in isolation, or in many countries' cases, if they shared electricity across their borders? So we'll look at both issues here. Well, if we looked at the end use demand for all energy in 2016, among these 143 countries, that was about 12.6 trillion watts in the annual average. In 2050, that's expected to go up to 20.3 trillion watts or terawatts. If we transition to wind, water, solar, electrify everything, that demand will go down about 57% to 8.7 terawatts. So how do we get a reduction of demand? Well, because I mentioned the efficiency of heat pumps, I mentioned there's also an efficiency of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell versus internal combustion engine vehicles. So just the vehicle transition alone, averaged over all sectors, would save 21.7% of all energy. And electrifying industry would save 3.4%. Using heat pumps for heating, building heating and cooling would save 13% average over all sectors. And then most people don't know that 12.1% of all energy worldwide is used to mine, transport, and refine fossil fuels and uranium. And if we eliminate fossil fuels and uranium, then we don't need to use that energy. So we save that as well. And then we think we can get another 6.6% energy efficiency improvements beyond business as usual. So that adds up to 57% reduction of demand. So the nice thing about that is, even if the cost per unit energy were the same with fossil fuels and wind, water, solar, because you're using 57% less energy with wind, water, solar, your actual cost per year will be 57% less. So I'll look at that in more detail in a second. Well, first, this is kind of the timeline of the transition. If we don't do anything, we go along this top line to 20.3 terawatts in 2020. But due to those, if we transition to wind, water, solar, due to those 5 reasons, we decrease the demand for energy over time. So there's 5 shades of colors. You go down to the 100% WWS line of 8.7 terawatts, and we try to meet that with just wind, solar, rooftop, and geothermal and hydro, and some tidal wave. And the transition is 80% by 2030 here and 100% by no later than 2050. So that's kind of our goal. So this kind of shows the mix of technologies among 143 countries. if we did this. And so, this is the average overall country. So each country has a different mix, but this is what it averages out to. So it's about 30.5% onshore wind, 14.5% offshore wind, 11% residential rooftop PV, 14% commercial government rooftop PV, 19% solar PV power plants, 4% CSP, almost 1% geothermal, 5.7% hydro, which all exists, and then a tiny amount of tidal and wave power. And that's in 2050. So you might ask, well, how much land does that all take up? Well, of course, offshore wind takes up no new land. Tidal and wave don't take up any new land. Hydro all exists in our plans, so we have no new land. Rooftop PV does not take up any new land. Geothermal is a very small amount, so hardly any land. And so it all comes down to utility PV plus CSP, which is about 0.17% of the world's land, and onshore wind, which is about 0.48. But if you remember from one of the first photos I showed you, there's a lot of space between those turbines that can be used for multiple purposes. And one of those purposes can be just putting utility PV on the same land as the wind. And those are called hybrid plants. And so anyway, 0.65% is the upper limit of what we need, but really that 0.48% of onshore wind, it's actually multiple purpose land that can be used. So that number, this 0.65%, can even be less if you put solar on that land as well. But just for comparison, well, in the United States, that number goes up to about 0.9%. However, in the United States right now, about 1.3% of all land area is consumed by the fossil fuel industry. So we would actually, that's due to like not only the 1.7 million active oil and gas wells and 2.3 million inactive ones, but the millions of miles of pipelines and the refineries and the storage facilities and the gas stations and coal mines and everything else. So we'd actually reduce the land requirements in the US if we transition to clean renewable energy. Now, can we keep the grid stable? So we did another study looking at trying to match demand with supply in 24 world regions encompassing the 143 countries. So in this study, the United States was its own region. And this shows results for 3 straight years on the top, where we looked at, and so I have, as I mentioned earlier, I built a climate model and also an air pollution model, but the climate model actually predicts the weather in it as well every 30 seconds. And so I output solar radiation fields and wind fields every 30 seconds worldwide for 3 years. And then I use that gives you intermittent wind and solar. And then in a combined geothermal and hydro and tidal wave and storage. And I tried to see, is it possible then to use that renewable energy and storage and also demand response, where utilities will give people incentives to shift the time of use of their electricity. Can you use generation, storage, and demand response and match the intermittent demand for energy that occurs in each of these world regions? So the top figure here shows for the US that yes, indeed, it says the load, which is the demand for energy plus changes in storage, plus losses from storage, transmission, distribution, and shedding, that equals the electricity and heat generation before losses from wind, water, solar every 30 seconds for 3 years throughout the US without any loss of load. And on the bottom shows the same thing, but for a 100-day period, where you can see it at better resolution, how the demand basically is matching the supply exactly. And so we were able to do this for 3 years in all 24 world regions encompassing the 143 countries. So you might ask, well, what's the cost of energy to do this? And basically this summarizes the world cost and US costs. And so the world cost of energy is on average about 9 cents per kilowatt hour. The capital cost for doing it is about 73 trillion. In the US, it's about 7.8 trillion and 9.3 cents a kilowatt hour. So that $7.8 trillion is really the Green New Deal cost of energy. That's how much it would cost to transition the entire US for all energy purposes to entirely wind, water, and solar, and storage, and transmission, and distribution, without any load loss, keeping the grid stable, eliminating all fossil fuels and uranium and biofuels and biomass, eliminating the 78,000 air pollution deaths that occur annually in the US, and eliminating US contributions from energy to global warming, and also providing energy security. So that's the Green New Deal cost based on rigorous calculations for the US. And then you can see the cost also for China and Europe. So this is one type of metric for cost, but let me look at another one really briefly, which is what's the annual cost of energy and the annual cost savings. So, today the annual cost of energy worldwide for all energy purposes for business as usual or BAU fuels is on the order of 10 or 11 trillion dollars. By 2050, that's expected to grow to 17.7 trillion. But the health cost of business as usual fuels, the health cost of those 7 million air pollution deaths per year, if you count for the costs of the deaths and the illnesses, the hundreds of millions of more illnesses, as well as non-health environmental costs of the air pollution, that's about $30 trillion per year. And the climate costs are also close to $30 trillion per year in 2050. So the total social cost, which is the energy plus health plus climate cost, is $76 trillion per year. But because wind, water, solar, there's about a 10% reduction of the cost per unit energy, but remember about a 57% reduction in the amount of energy used. So there's a 61.4% reduction of energy costs, so it's $6.8 trillion per year instead of 17.7. And the social cost is 91% less because there's no health or climate costs associated with wind, water, solar. So instead of 76 trillion a year, it's 6.8 trillion. That's a 91% drop in the cost. So if anybody tells you the Green New Deal is expensive, I think they have the opposite. Okay, so let's just move on quickly to some policies. And so there are, in order to transition, we do need effective policies put in place worldwide, but not only at the national level, but at state and province levels and city levels. And in addition, individuals can do a lot to transition. So far, there are 61 countries that have committed to 100% renewable electricity. And keep in mind, electricity is only 20% of all end-use energy. So we really need to transition the other energy sectors as well. But for electricity, and most of these countries are pretty small countries, but still, and they don't necessarily have the means to transition quickly. But fortunately, costs are coming down for solar and wind and storage and electric cars and everything else. So this is good news. But the first thing that we do need are commitments, because without commitments, you're certainly never going to get a transition at the scale and the speed that we need. In the United States, surprisingly, there have actually been 8 resolutions and bills submitted over the years for the United States to go 100% renewable. The first one was in 2015, which was a resolution, House Resolution 540, for the US to go to 100% renewables. And then there was a Senate resolution in 2016 as well. Anyway, you can see them all. The most recent were the US Green New Deal resolutions that required 100% renewable energy for the US by 2030. But of course, none of these has been voted on. So, but my point is that there has been interest in it at the national level. On the other hand, there have been multiple states, in fact, 14 states and territories that have laws or executive orders for going to 100% renewables. Rhode Island has the most aggressive 2030 goal of 100%, Washington, D.C. by 2032, Connecticut by 2040, Hawaii, California, New Mexico, Washington State, and New York by 2045, and then Puerto Rico, Nevada, Maine, Wisconsin, Virginia, and New Jersey by 2050. So this is really good progress. And I'm pleased to say that these laws were really spurred initially. Well, we had developed plans for all 50 states. And the first one was a New York energy plan. And then the second one was a California plan. And the third one was Washington State. But the New York plan we brought to the New York governor in around 2013. And by 2015 or 16, he had proposed a 50% law after asking us for suggestions of how to implement or what are 5 first steps that New York should take. And then we similarly took our California plan to New York, to California Governor Brown. And then 3 months later, he passed a law, or he signed it, or proposed a law actually, that was for 50% renewable electricity in California. And that eventually became SB 100, which was 100% renewable electricity. And so, and then we did plans for all 50 states. And so it's been great to see that all these states kind of jumped on the bandwagon subsequently, but with the help of many groups, nonprofits especially. So in fact, well, I'll get to the nonprofits in a sec, but in the meantime, there are also 176 US cities and counties that have committed to 100% renewables. And the blue ones are kind of large cities, and some of the orange ones or the red ones are smaller cities, but there are many more. But cities like Atlanta and Chicago, San Francisco, and San Diego have all committed to 100% renewable electricity. But again, this has been driven, in this case, a lot by the Sierra Club and their, who we were working with for a while through this nonprofit I helped co-found called the Solutions Project. And so the Sierra Club, yeah, they're motivated by our roadmaps for this at the state level, decided to go and take on all these cities, and because they have a huge network on the ground of activists and people who can talk to policymakers. And they've really done an amazing job of getting all these cities. Of course, there have been other groups that have helped as well, but this was really something that was really helpful. And then there are 235 companies, at least, that have committed to 100% renewables. And recently, these companies are really driving the change because, I mean, these companies put the renewables in pretty quickly. Well, I should point out first that 8 out of the 10 biggest companies in the world, which are the ones in blue, have all committed to 100% renewables. And a lot of them use renewables to power data centers and everything else. But you know, they're putting up solar and wind farms and some geothermal throughout the world. And this is really driving the growth of renewables quite a bit. And it's also helping states meet their goals. So it's a combination of all these companies, these city mandates, the state mandates that are really have driven the fact that now the US, as I mentioned, is around 22% wind, water, solar for its electric power. But as I mentioned, there are lots of nonprofits. So there are over 100 nonprofits now that have committed to 100% renewables. And this is really without, you know, coalition behind this transition. It'd be very difficult to get people to agree for such a goal. So yeah, I'm very pleased that so many people have gotten together and decided that this is such an important goal that they've really spurred on all these commitments by states and cities and companies in particular. Okay, so let me just summarize, then we can go to questions. So I didn't talk about jobs, but we did find in our study that worldwide we would create 28 million more long-term full-time jobs than lost. In the US, it's about 3 million more jobs than are lost. So these are a combination of construction and operation jobs. And the construction jobs are 40-year jobs, so they're not just one-time construction jobs. We'd require only 0.65% of the world's land for footprint plus spacing, and that's a reduction compared with what the fossil fuel industry occupies. We'd avoid about 7 million air pollution deaths per year. We would slow and reverse global warming. We think we can keep the grid stable throughout the world with 100% wind, water, solar. The absolute energy costs are about 60% less for wind, water, solar than for fossil fuels. The energy plus health plus climate costs are 90% less. And I just want to point out, if anybody's interested, there's more information. There's not only a short course at this top website, but I'm teaching a kind of a full term course. The last couple of years I had taught it that's online, and I'll do it again next spring. So that's another option, although right now Stanford charges a lot of tuition for that. But hopefully it's going to be a free online class at some point. And then the second web link is if you want to look at our plans for states and cities and countries, that's a link for that. The solutionsproject.org also has infographic maps where you can click on a state or a country or a city, and up will pop an energy plan. And then I just completed a textbook on 100% wind, water, solar that's coming out, I think September 25th. And that's basically follows the course, the new course. And it's really talks about everything I've talked about here, but in a lot more detail. And I also tweet a lot about energy and our studies and other studies that come out. So that's another source of information. So with that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jacobson. Can everyone hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear.
Great, great. Thank you so much. Before we get into the questions, I'll give you a chance to take a drink there. I want to throw out that Marian, who's our NCCCA secretary, she always sends a follow-up email following these presentations, and we'll make sure that we get your links that you just included in that last slide in there, because those are really important. And I'm also going to include in there some information about how people can use scholar.google.com to try to follow the work that you've been doing. You work with a lot of students, and so your name gets attached onto a lot of publishing that happens because you're a co-author on a lot of papers. So I think this would be an interesting way for people to start learning how to read about the science side of things with the help of some search engines that are actually tuned for that. Okay, so the first question that we have is actually one that I had from Merrill. And he asks, along with other prominent scientists like our July 2020 NCCCA guest speaker, Michael Mann, your work has been targeted by various doubting individuals and organizations. As renewable technologies become more ubiquitous and costs continue to plummet, are you seeing the forces continue to challenge the veracity of your findings?
Less and less. I mean, back in 2009, when the first article came out, I mean, nobody believed that it was possible. I mean, people were talking about, is it possible to have 20% of renewables on the grid and keep the grid stable? And, we went all the way to 100% and argued that. And now if you actually look at the latest attacks and stuff, people have conceded that it's possible to do 20%. They say it's possible to do up to 80%, but no more than that. So suddenly the goalpost. So I'm pretty proud to say that we've shifted that goalpost from a 20% belief to 80% at least. We still think it's 100%, and that's what we find in our studies. But 80% is basically a random number. It's just people want to, and usually the people who want to limit it to 80% say that because they want to include nuclear power, or they want to include carbon capture, they want to include biofuels, all the things we don't include in our studies. So it's not based on any rational science. It's based on wanting to include other things that aren't renewables.
Okay.
Clean renewables.
Thank you. And I just want to point out that you've really only scratched the surface here with your knowledge on this subject. And so I do encourage folks to try to read a lot of the work that you've done, because it's very extensive. And I think for every one of the topics that you talked about tonight, there's a ton to really read about and learn a lot more about, and folks will be even more convinced about the arguments that you're making here when they take the time to do that. So I just want to throw that out there, because as compelling as your presentation was here, I'm not sure that it's always apparent to folks just how much of a kind of thought leader you are in this space, because you've been doing it for a long time and you're trying to really test and measure all of the work that others are doing. So we really appreciate, where you're coming from and the work that you're doing at the university.
Okay, thanks.
So Bud Tidlow asked, is a national conversation or conversion to 100% renewables by 2030 still within reason? And if so, what key things need to happen to make that conversion become a reality?
Well, I think in some states and in some sectors, yeah, we'll definitely get 100%. I mean,
why does he put Cort Casady?
California is already at like 55% wind, water, solar, and it's only 2020. And, and I think we'll get to 100% this is in the electric power sector, that is. And so I think California will actually get to 100%, at least in the annual average, by 2026 or 7. Some other states will too. They're actually, like Iowa has like almost 60% wind in their electric power. And there are some states like Washington State's like it's 70% hydro. So it shouldn't be hard in the electric power sector to get to 100%. But in the national average, I think we can if we actually put our minds to it. And we have to go through across more than one sector. So it's not just electricity. We have to transition at least 80% of cars by 2030. I don't think we'll get to 100% of cars by then at all. But it is possible, but we need aggressive actions, not only at the state level, but also at the federal level. And currently, with the current coronavirus and the economy kind of very shaky, it's hard to put a lot of there is a lot of funding going to spending, and if more of that can go to renewables, that'll help. It's interesting to note, I read a story that in the first 6 months of 2020, coal went down 30%, but renewables went up 5%. So even in this climate, there is still this growth of renewables, which is good news, and a big replacement, a big loss of fossil fuels. So I would say in some places, we'll definitely have 100% leased electricity in some other sectors. But to get 100% across all sectors and across the entire US, we will need really aggressive policy action, which is possible, but we just need to get the right people in office who will vote for these types of things.
Great answer. So political will is a big part of it,
right?
If not the biggest. Eve Simmons asked, and I put some of my own spin on this question a little bit. Saul Griffith of Rewiring America was featured in a Vox article last week, making the argument with their report mobilizing for a zero carbon America, jobs, 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 and more jobs, job and employment study report. The electrification will make our energy transformation pretty straightforward. So have you gotten a chance to look at that? I know it got a lot of buzz, came out at the end of July, and he seems to be sort of in the same mind frame as you, but he does actually recommend the doubling of nuclear, which I don't think that you back at all.
Yeah, well, I think if I read, I might have looked it over, and he might have suggested 100 gigawatts of nuclear. I mean, right now the U.S. has 100 gigawatts of nuclear, so he's saying, yeah, doubling it, but that's impossible because U.S. nuclear output since 2000 is less today than 2006, and it takes 10 to 19 years between planning and operation of a single nuclear reactor, and there's only one even being constructed right now, and it's 5 or 6 years over time and billions over budget, and may never actually get completed, although it may get completed. But there's just nothing happening in the nuclear, in terms of conventional nuclear reactors, and even small modular reactors. They're not even projecting anything new for at least 5 or 6 years. So it's literally impossible for new nuclear to help solve this problem. There's just physically, even if we wanted it to, it just won't happen. There's less going up. I mean, even in 2020, there's the same report I said, there's 30% less coal production than last year. Well, there's 5% less nuclear production than last year. That's existing nuclear. And then you have some of these existing nuclear plants were getting subsidies, and it turns out that in 2 cases in Ohio and Illinois, it was due to bribery, and because they just are so unaffordable and they're so costly. So unless they get subsidies, they're going to fold these nuclear reactors, and so you're going to see more closures of nuclear than new ones. So to suggest that we're going to have 100 gigawatts of new nuclear in 10 years, it's impossible because you can't even get one nuclear plant up in 10 years.
Yeah, okay, don't shoot the messenger, but same question about thorium. Pretty negative on the concept that thorium suddenly going to become a great nuclear solution.
Thorium is probably even harder than uranium because hardly anybody has any experience with thorium. So to actually, first of all, build a thorium reactor, it's going to take even longer. And then to train people to actually use it, take longer. And it's a little bit safer in terms of weapons proliferation, but there has been a bomb developed from thorium. So it's not much of an improvement. And I think it's actually more costly and will take longer.
All right, let's pivot away from nuclear because
Carl, can I step? That wasn't my question at all. It
sorry.
was more about. Sorry, there was the good that Saul Griffith was trying to do, just in the idea of forwarding full electrification, which just reminded me of you too, because I've been a huge fan of yours. But there is so much that, again, Paul Hawken and Drawdown, and where perhaps you guys, you brilliant treasures that we need so desperately, possibly collaborate or work together on, I don't know if that's possible. I know the Solutions Project is wonderful in that vein, and I wonder if that could be expanded. I want to circle the wagons and bring these brilliant minds together.
Well, I think, well, there are lots of groups. Actually, there are about 14 groups, scientific groups worldwide that I know of, and probably more, that are working on 100% renewables. And we all interact, it's actually good to have lots of independent work, because first of all, especially if you're, so part of Saul Griffith's work that's looking at electrification, I mean, that's what we want to do, is we do want to electrify everything. And I think the only difference there is he's proposing some electrification from nuclear, which, and I'm saying we don't need that, and it probably wouldn't even happen. That doesn't mean, but the rest of his message is right. I mean, we do need to electrify everything as fast as possible, and that's going to be, the most efficient. That's how you get rid of pollution, is by electrifying things, as long as you're providing the electricity with things that are not emitting. But in terms of collaborating, we do collaborate and talk with a lot of different groups, and we do bounce ideas off each other. A lot of publications coming out from different groups, and they tackle issues from different angles. So I think it's all good to have this positive energy in the same direction. And I think as we move forward, we'll see that these studies become closer and closer together, because a lot of these proposed technologies just aren't working, and so they get shut off after a few years.
Okay, so that's actually a good segue into a very quick and hopefully short discussion on direct air capture and CCS. Do you see those winding down? We know that the CCS, the latest CCS story is the last remaining operable station said they can't do it anymore because it's not cost effective. Are those both just something that we should stop our thought leaders and our policymakers from banking on?
Yeah, so carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and use, depending on if you're storing the carbon or using it. And there's also direct air capture, where you're trying to take carbon out of the ambient air directly. They are both completely useless. I mean, I did a study looking at, there was one coal plant in the US that had carbon capture equipment associated with it. It was the Petronova plant in Texas. And it cost $1 billion to put the carbon capture equipment up. And that, you could have used that 1 billion just to replace the entire coal plant with wind or solar, and you would have had money left over, and you would have eliminated all the air pollution from the coal. You would have eliminated the mining from the coal, and as well as all the CO2 from the coal. But what did they do with that $1 billion? They built a natural gas plant to run the carbon capture equipment. So now instead of just mining the coal, they're also mining gas, causing more pollution. They're not eliminating any air pollution from the coal, because carbon capture equipment does not eliminate air pollution. In fact, they have more air pollution from the gas now and all the upstream mining and leaks. And the carbon capture equipment is not very efficient. And none of the CO2 from the natural gas plant was captured, or from the mining. So if you look at the 20-year time frame, that whole facility, the carbon capture equipment is only capturing about 11% of the original CO2 emissions from the coal plant, 11% of the total emissions, due to the fact that you have all the extra natural gas, etc. And over a 100-year time frame, it was only about 20 to 30%. And then what were they using the CO2 for? Where it's piped to a nearby oil field to increase oil recovery, enhance oil recovery. So they basically the CO2 binds with the oil to make it less dense, so they can pump more up to the surface. And that process releases about half the CO2 back to the air. And then you burn the oil, and so you have more oil burning, and that's more pollution and CO2. So this is a big boondoggle. It's just a complete waste of money, and really a tragedy that we're distracted by it. And there's really no way, there's no situation that carbon capture can be better than just taking a wind turbine or solar panel and replacing coal or gas. Because when you use carbon capture, you're never reducing air pollution, you're only increasing it or keeping it the same. you're never reducing mining. But if you replace coal or gas with wind or solar, you eliminate mining, you eliminate air pollution, and you eliminate the CO2. And you don't have any leaks, after the fact. So I would say it's really being pushed by the fossil fuel industry to keep themselves alive, and don't fall for any scam claims that carbon capture is useful for anything.
Okay, thank you. Let's take a little bit of a tack. Can you talk a little bit about what it's been like to work with college students, and can you tell us how their approach to tackling these issues might have helped you gain a new perspective? And you're constantly having new grad students come through. You're teaching them things, but I hope that they're teaching you some things too. What have you learned from grad students?
Well, yeah, so first, I'm really proud of our students. So since 2004, I started a program with a couple other people in our department in civil environmental engineering at Stanford called the Atmosphere Energy Program, where we combined a small group of faculty of atmospheric science with a small group of energy science, because there are students who are interested in both. But the purpose of the program is to try to understand and solve these large problems. And since then, we've had over 400 master's students, graduates, as well as undergrads and PhD students. And this has made me really proud. These students are very passionate about solving atmospheric and climate problems in particular. And they come into the program passionate. And then when they leave, they go into industry, they go into some academics, some go into government, some go into nonprofits, but they're out there changing the world now. And I'm just looking at them around the world. I see them doing great things, and that just makes me really proud. And yeah, I've learned a lot from them. I mean, they correct me on certain things. They're bright students who are also helping in several of these studies that I've talked about. I mean, like this 143 country study, there were several students who helped with that. But most of our studies, there have been, I think, now over 100 students that have unpublished papers related to 100% renewables. And so this also makes me feel good that I've helped, them and try to, find something that they were passionate about, but also, they've helped and contributed to the research as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's fantastic. The program that you have there is sort of multiplying the work that you're doing just by the fact that you're giving these students an avenue, a space to come in, learn, and then go out there and then try things that you haven't even thought about yet, probably. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm very proud of them.
So Philip Watts asks, as a company developing renewable energy projects that fall within the scope of the Solutions Project, 10 to 15 megawatt distributed generation solar and storage projects ahead of the meter for California CCAs. Where can we, so he's talking about his companies, he's looking for some advice here, where can we get more financial support for early development, funding to accelerate new projects, and how do they get more regulatory support from CPUC, CAISO, and other state entities? Do you have any ideas about that?
I'm less helpful there, not because I don't want to be, but it's more I haven't worked in that space where I'm not actually developing new technologies. But I do hear this same question, but also concerned of trying to get support for funding. I mean, certainly DOE, Department of Energy, and California Energy Commission, they often have projects, but beyond that, I can't say specifically. And there are a lot of startups that are getting venture capital funding. But besides those general sources, I don't know specifically what the best sources are. And in terms of regulation and better regulatory environment, I think it's now easier. I mean, in California, it's probably easier because it's controlled by one party and who likes renewables. And so certainly getting in state governments, lawmakers who are friendly to renewable development and technologies is probably the best way. And there are also state organizations or like the Energy State Commissions that are probably helpful in this as well. But yeah, I'm giving probably vague answers because I'm not really in that space.
So this might be something that a Green New Deal needs to help focus on, is give these small startup companies their space to do their work too.
Yeah, well, that's definitely would be helpful.
From Marcia Bookstein, what are your thoughts about lithium mining? And she's concerned about other countries and possible overthrow of governments to get access to lithium on their lands.
Well, in terms of mining, yeah, nobody wants to do anything to hurt the environment. I mean, if we could solve all our problems without any mining or even putting up any solar or wind turbines, that would be great. But we do need to do something. But the mining, let's say of lithium or even all the materials that we need for a 100% renewable economy, it's orders of magnitude less than the mining that's currently going on with the fossil fuel industry. So for example, in the United States, every year, there are 50,000 new oil and gas wells drilled. And these basically, once you drill them, you have, especially the gas wells, you've got to fill them with cement once their life is over, and they can still leak. I mean, I think 5% of gas wells leak initially, and then 50% over their lifetime. And even when you fill them in, usually it's a shoddy job. And so many of these 2.3 million inactive oil and gas wells now leak methane. And so when we talk about mining, we only, for batteries, it's once every, depending on the lifetime of the battery, and and if we can't recycle, we might be able to recycle lithium for several generations. But it's one-time mining versus this continuous everyday mining that we need to do forever with the fossil fuel industry. So the damage that's done from lithium mining, but also other types of mining for wind, water, solar, it's orders of magnitude less than the damage that's being done and will be done in the future due to the fossil fuel industry in particular. And so, yeah, I wouldn't get too tied up. I mean, we do want to make it better. In fact, there are a lot of companies now doing their mining with 100% renewables. I shouldn't say a lot, there's some. And this is really good news. I mean, there was one in Texas, for example, that's going to be mining rare earths with 100% renewable electricity. And so that's an improvement. It's not, doesn't, stop the digging. But yeah, we're not going to be able to solve all the problems, but I think that's it's an improvement compared to what we have right now. Even if we have to do lithium mining.
Yeah, and I will say also that it's not just lithium. When we're talking about lithium battery technologies and a lot of these different technologies, there are limits to the resources. And so is that part of what you study too, is seeing whether we have the available resources to follow through with all these commitments that we're hoping to make?
Yeah, well, with regard to lithium, there's enough known resource for 5 billion vehicles, and there are 1.1 billion vehicles in the world. So, and that's, usually those resource numbers are based on what's known today, but once people start looking for more, they usually find more. So I'm not so concerned you'd run out of lithium. And usually for like wind turbines, you need neodymium for permanent magnets in the generators. But you can power the entire world with wind and still use only 1/7 of the neodymium. So again, and with solar, even the elements there, you can always use a different element if you get short of one element. So I'm not worried about shortages of materials. They will be shortages at certain periods, and that will just cause the price to rise temporarily. But as you find more materials, that will drop again.
I think that's a really good point. We tend to focus on what is the currently highest efficiency, say solar panel, but we don't think in terms of, well, if we need to scale all this up, or we do run out of one resource, we've got a big pipeline of technologists out there that are working on the next solar cells, on the next battery storage. You went over a lot of different types of storage. You mentioned piped hydro storage. Have you seen any prospective projects for doing pumped hydro with ocean water? On the coast here in California, it seems like there should be opportunities to take the ocean water, pump it uphill, and run it back down.
Yeah, I've seen some ideas where you go out in the deep ocean and try to lift water from deep down to the surface, but I don't know of any specific projects that are kind of off the ground in California, for example, on that. But yeah, that's a potential when you have already one pool of water, the ocean, and you just need to create another pool, up a cliff or something. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people not liking that, but um, yeah, but fortunately, there are many different storage technologies, and that's kind of why these gravitational mass is so nice. It's basically pumped hydro, but it takes up so little land area, basically going up and down with these concrete blocks. And it costs about the same and is just as efficient as pumped hydro. So that might be the alternative. You get less objection.
So they may look silly, but you think those might actually be very practical?
Yeah, I think they are actually very practical. Well, I don't know how big of a volume you can create. I don't know how many, I think you can do anything on a large scale. And the company that's building them claims that they're cost effective, and they're commercializing them right now. So we'll see. I don't want to say yes, it's great, but until I actually see it.
Yeah, but maybe a variation on it, right? That it's a decent theme at least.
Yeah, the idea is, I mean, I think it works on on a small scale for sure. And whether you can do it on a large scale, it's a different story.
Okay. Question from Chelsea Sparty. She's deeply concerned about the intensified push for new fossil fuels and nuclear in Puerto Rico. And you're doing such great work with Solutions Project. What do we have to be optimistic for on the island?
Well, Puerto Rico, they have a law to go to 100% renewable electricity. So according to their current law, there's no room for nuclear or fossil fuels for electricity, maybe for transportation. But I think the nuclear portion, I think that was being pushed because once President Trump found that Puerto Rico passed this law against going for 100% renewables, he was then trying to push nuclear into Puerto Rico. I don't know if that's where it originated, but I think I saw some story about that. I mean, I think it's a lot of talk, and you have to actually see if there's any reality to it. But they have a good idea because they were devastated by this hurricane where all their power went out for 9 months, I think, and it was mostly because the grid went down, and they had a centralized grid that if one component went down, a lot of the whole grid went down. So they're breaking the island up into, I think, 7 regions. So basically a bunch of not microgrids, but mini grids that are interconnected, but they can act independently. And then you'd have renewables in each section, and which is a cool idea actually. So that would, if one part of the transmission system goes down, it doesn't affect the other quadrants or other parts of the transmission system. But for Puerto Rico, you don't need fossil fuels or uranium. So they will quickly see that once they start installing. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm still here. So yeah, I don't know too much about the push for fossil fuels or uranium beyond what I just said.
Okay. Next question is from Ben Plackmeyer. What challenges besides political will would municipalities have in supporting the Green New Deal?
Well, there are always people who are against change, and so I think it is a social change. I mean, each municipality needs to come up with a specific plan to replace their fossil fuel infrastructure with renewables. So I think it's part of it is just going source by source. Like, for example, you want to get rid of all of natural gas in buildings, and that can be done. I mean, in 2005, when I remodeled my first home, I got rid of all the gas and replaced the gas heaters with heat pumps, and also for air and water, both air and water. So it was possible back in 2005, and today it's much easier. So it's possible to go into a big city and go through every single apartment, every single building, and get rid of the gas and replace it with electricity. But it does take effort. There's resistance. People, if they're comfortable with the way they are, they don't want to change. If it's going to cost people money to replace and they don't see any immediate benefit, that's going to cause some friction. So I think, there might be pushback against ordinances to, get rid of fossil fuels. But I think the way to solve that is through incentives. Well, certainly new construction, if you require new construction to be renewable, that's one way. California has a law that all new construction needs to be net zero. And so that really means solar on every new building or every new residential building. But the key is to try to retrofit existing buildings, because there are a lot of those. And there you need incentives, you need some laws, but there will be resistance. In transportation, you know, there's still people buying fossil fuel vehicles. I see them all over the place. But a vehicle fleet turns over in 15 years. So if we can get all new vehicles sold to be electric, then, you know, 15, 20 years, we'll have 90% electric vehicles. But I think we do need effective laws, but there will be people who don't want to change that, or there might be, if it costs people money, then they're going to be resistant.
Okay, next question is from Paige Decino. What's the impact from rare metals in batteries environmentally and socially? Where are we with recycling of the batteries and the other materials? Do we still have you, Mark? Excuse me. Yeah.
Yeah, Mark froze up.
All right. We'll wait and see if he drops back in. I don't know if we lost his connection or he's just, here we are.
Oh, there.
Sorry, Mark.
Okay.
Did you hear that question or should I repeat it?
Yeah, no, I heard the question.
Okay.
Well, I think it's like the answer to the last question. First of all, it's if we compare batteries and their impacts, is just so much smaller than the continued use of fossil fuels, because all the mining and the raw resources we're using for fossil fuels, we're basically burning it up and spitting it into the air, and people are breathing and dying. And whereas the batteries, it's sitting in a car for 15 years. And even if you put it in a waste dump, it would have impacts, but it would be trivial compared to all the impacts of the waste from fossil fuels. But in fact, car companies do recycle batteries and will recycle more in the future. So I think that's certainly we have to be vigilant and make sure to ensure that everything does get recycled, but that's not a problem I would worry about.
Okay. Next question is from Dana Amanda. What do you think of the potential for using decommissioned coal power plants as storage areas? And says, I've read about converting the boilers to molten salt storage.
Yeah, so, well, certainly the transmission infrastructure for coal can be used for renewables. I think there was some plant, maybe it was a coal plant that was on the coast, on the East Coast, where it was converted to like a shipping dock for wind turbines, or they were going to manufacture wind turbines at the location. Yeah, I think if you have coal-fired power plant, you can use the turbine for something. You can use it for, as a steam turbine where this steam is for, maybe you can recycle it for using concentrated solar power. Yeah, I'm all for recycling or using old coal or old gas equipment for other purposes. Yeah, so I think that's my answer.
So I noticed in your slide earlier, you did mention CSP, and it does have that benefit of storage with the molten salts, but it seems like the ones that we've put up so far have not proven to be great installations. Some of them had natural gas to sort of get things up to speed. Some of them wrote PPAs that they couldn't really match what they had promised. And so they ran natural gas to fulfill their PPAs. Are you seeing CSP going away, or you think that we're going to keep improving it?
Well, I think you're thinking mostly of Ivanpah, which does not have a storage associated with it. But there are others, ones that do. Yeah, so Ivanpah, I think they use gas to either turn it on or also use gas maybe when there wasn't any sun or something. But other plants have been much more effective. And the cost of CSP has dropped, especially in other countries. And even in the US, I think Solar Reserve has a CSP plant that's pretty effective with storage. So yeah, there are some bad apple examples, but there are also some really good examples, and the cost has come down. And so really the comparison is CSP with storage versus PV plus batteries. And right now, PV is cheaper than the CSP plant, but the CSP storage is cheaper than batteries. And overall, if you combine the two, PV plus CSP is still, sorry, PV plus batteries is winning. But the costs have really dropped a lot for CSP plus storage. And there is a niche, that's why it's going to be maybe a few percent of our plan, whereas PV is a much higher percent of the overall plan.
Yeah.
But certainly in solar, in desert regions, I mean, you can get a very high efficiency with CSP. And once it's perfected, it'll be very efficient and cost effective.
I think we tend to think of the molten salt like it's just some, kind of like a hot water. And I think in reality, it's a little bit like nuclear power is just fission. But in reality, when you're working with molten salts and then you have a problem, sometimes it takes you months to get that system back up again. That's what happened in Crescent Dunes, I think. So it doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means that the teething is pretty bad at first.
Well, yeah, and I think there are also other types of storage media. There's phase change materials as opposed to molten salt. And I don't know if that's more theoretical or they actually implemented that, but from a theoretical study I saw on phase change materials, it was more efficient than molten salt. And it also takes less volume and is probably less likely to cause problems like you just mentioned. So yeah, I think it's an evolving technology. I think it's certainly worth pursuing still to see if it works. If in 5 or 10 years it's no better than today, then yeah, maybe it's time to think again.
Next question is from Brett Garrett. I'm curious to know if Dr. Jacobson is aware of CVCE's plan to accept carbon-free attributes from Diablo Canyon nuclear plant, or if there's any update regarding that plan.
SVCE, the Silicon Valley CCA.
Sorry, are you asking whether Silicon Valley Clean Energy is going to take Diablo Canyon nuclear and call it 100% renewable?
Last I knew, they were planning to. I'm in the Monterey Bay Community Power area, and we had a huge debate about whether to do the same thing that San Jose and Silicon Valley were doing. And there was a lot of community pressure, mostly from San Luis Obispo. And they're not planning to take the attributes, but I think Silicon Valley is still taking them.
Yes, Silicon Valley is. It's called, PG&E is offering what they're calling nuclear attributes, carbon-free attributes that are coming from the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. And Silicon Valley did accept it.
Well, yeah, so I don't think it'll last long because Diablo Canyon will close. There's no way it's staying open. Because the reason they're closing is because there's a law that requires new cooling that would effectively require Diablo Canyon to have new cooling towers because of its cooling method right now just causes a lot of damage. And the estimates for that when they did bids were like between $7 and $15 billion for the cooling tower replacement. And you could, first of all, just take that money and replace Diablo Canyon entirely. So it's just uneconomical to continue running it. So it's going to shut down for sure. So when that happens, there won't be any more credits. But I didn't know that Silicon Valley Clean Energy was considering using credits from Diablo Canyon. But as long as they're upfront about it and telling people what they're getting,
Are you aware of how that's affecting the exit fees that are being charged to the community choice that are causing great distress on them? Do you have, so the nuclear power plant is considered a stranded asset basically now. And so the customers who have exited from PG&E are being charged a large fee for that, called the PCIA fee. So
you're saying customers who have PG&E for their generation portion of their bill, if they move to
the CCAs are the customers of CCAs who have left PG&E are being charged this large PCIA fee, an exit fee, because PG&E is saying you're leaving us with a bunch of stranded assets. and there's no sunset on that fee. They want to keep charging it to us.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if PG&E is trying to charge for all their fire losses and everything else in San Bruno, and lumping it all together.
We'll try to cover that in the future, folks, because I know that that's something that Dr. Jacobs is probably not an expert on, but I do appreciate that everyone has these concerns, and we are dealing here in San Diego with 2 new CCAs who are having to decide where they're going to procure their energy from. And it's a complicated subject. The state has lots of laws about categories 1, 2, and 3. And then these CCAs start up and they've got to figure out how to navigate that space. So it is tricky stuff. Next question is from Dieter Scheibel. How long would it take to build the infrastructure to support this transition? In other words, if you were given the keys to the ship tomorrow, how quickly do you think we can move things forward?
Well, I don't think I think it's all a question of willpower, because, in World War II, the world built like 700,000 or 800,000 aircraft in 5 years from a standstill. So, there is really no limit as long if we can divert resources and people to working on these things. I'm sure there'll be a startup time, but there's a wind farm in the North Sea it's like almost a 1 gigawatt. I think it was like 800 megawatt wind farm, and it's taking 1 year to construct this. So keep it just, it takes right now for, let's say, a nuclear reactor, it takes on the order, just the construction time right now is on the order of 9, 10, and some of these are going 11, 12 years. It took 1 year. Started October 2019, and it's halfway done, and they're scheduled to be finished October 2020. And that's how fast you can put up an offshore wind farm. And it used to be that offshore wind farm would take 2 or 3 times longer than an onshore wind farm. This is taking 1 year. So you can install things now. Whether you can produce the wind turbines fast enough, that's another thing you have to ramp up. But that's just, there's not a limit to how fast you can do it if you actually have enough people and funding to do it. So I think all I can say is as fast as possible. So we can set a goal and we just do it as fast as we can. If we don't meet it, okay, well, we're still doing the best we can. I think we can't say we failed unless we've tried our hardest. And yeah, I think that's what we got to do.
Yeah, it seems like that's what municipalities have been doing. You showed that in your slide presentation, that different folks have said by this date, and it's usually a date when they'll be way out of office, that,
Right.
We'll make these targets.
That's right.
But maybe we get people to start committing to do it while they're in office, right?
Well, actually, yeah. Joe Biden's plan, it was a plan, he hasn't passed it, but I think he's saying he wanted to spend, was it $3 trillion or $2 trillion in 4 years? I mean, if he spends $2 trillion, I said that the Green New Deal for the US would cost $8 trillion. If he spends $2 trillion in 4 years, that's 1/4 of the entire transition in 4 years. And that would be amazing. I mean, that would be a rapid start if it actually happens. I mean, there's a lot of talk right now, but.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that there would be a ramp up and that some of those jobs would sustain, others of them, as we finish building things, might go away. But I guess we also have to consider this is a worldwide demand. So even if we maybe, jump started and got things accomplished here in the United States, there's probably going to be a long demand for these things to be exported, or even for our folks to help other countries spool up if they needed the help.
That's right. Yeah, it's a worldwide problem, and there are actually 10 countries that are 100% renewable electricity already. So the U.S. is actually, it's a bigger country than all these, but percentage-wise, it's much further behind. But there are other countries that are just nowhere, and some have civil wars, some are are impoverished. And so those countries are going to be the hardest to transition, the ones that have economic or social difficulties. And so, yeah, we do need to help wherever it's possible through exporting technologies, but also trying to reduce barriers to implementing worldwide these technologies.
Do you think that this load demand and smart grids, do you think that that actually has a lot further that we can take it than what we've thought about right now? Or do you think people have already thought through the best solutions that we'll have, we just haven't implemented them yet?
Well, in terms of technology, I mean, I think we have 95% of the technologies we need. Of course, if we develop better technologies, that'll just make it easier and more efficient. So yeah, we don't need to preclude not having better technologies, but I also don't think we should hold out for a miracle technology because we don't need one. We can do a lot with what we have right now.
Right. So we should probably be combining that refrigerator freezer with that hot water heater into a single system. Have you seen that done yet?
You're talking about the ice storage or the
no, more like a heat pump is throwing off cool air because it's exchanging that heat into the heat pump, and that cool air is wasted into a space, and then somewhere else in the home we're doing the opposite with a refrigerator.
Yeah, because a refrigerator is basically the air conditioning unit for the heat pump, and yeah, but you have waste heat that goes out the back of the refrigerator. So yeah, trapping that heat. That's kind of what that Stanford district heating system does. It takes when you produce heat, you have waste cold. When you produce cold, you have waste heat. If you actually capture the waste heat, put it in the boiler, and you capture the waste cold, you put it in the cooler, you save it until you need it. And that's what makes that system so efficient. But yeah, doing that in a building, with a refrigerator or other technologies that need heat pumps, that's a good idea. Yeah, I'll have to see what happens though.
Okay, I have another question. This one's from Merrill. After campaigning in opposition to fracking, and on the same day in April 2020, the New York Governor Andrew Cuomo permanently banned fracking in New York, California's Governor Gavin Newsom quietly lifted the 9-month moratorium. Since then, his administration has approved 48 new permits. Would you characterize the governor's pivot as anti-climate? And if so, what would you say to him about his ideological turnaround? And I apologize, I did say I was going to try not to get too political here, but in general, like, how do you feel when you see folks that feel like, just a little bit more natural gas, a little bit more fracking? What's your reaction?
I mean, at this point, we have to stop all fossil fuel growth and reverse it, and stop oil production, gas production. Really, it is beneficial. I mean, the thing is, it's as I showed in some of the numbers there, it costs more to maintain a fossil fuel system. The cost of energy is more, the health costs are greater. California is in particular, there are 13,000 deaths per year from air pollution and hundreds of thousands more ill, especially in Los Angeles, the Central Valley. And, so if you look at the social costs of these fossil fuels, he's probably looking, there's some revenue benefit from the, keeping this oil. It's usually oil fracking in California is getting more oil, but you have a higher social cost from health and climate. And plus you're just allowing this infrastructure to persist and creating something that's even harder to change. So it's a bad decision. I mean, there's no, you have to, I think at this point, we have to change things so fast. We need an 80% transition by 2030 that we cannot afford, one more oil well, one more gas well. And we need to shut everything down now and certainly not approve new things. It's not enough to say we're stopping coal because, there's oil, there's gas, there's also biomass too that burns. And, all this pollution needs to stop. And so, I don't agree with it.
So a question from Kathy Nicholson. When you model the energy output of the solar and wind systems in the future, are you factoring in the weather changes that will happen as a result of inevitable changes in our climate? For instance, there will be more atmospheric moisture. I assume there'll be more cloud cover more often, which will reduce the output of PV systems. she also assumes the temperature gradients will be reduced, which will result in reduction in wind for the wind turbines.
Yeah, so I mean, I account, well, so as I mentioned, I built a climate model that does this. It predicts the weather and the climate and air pollution, and they interact with each other, among each other. And so the simulations I showed you were for 2050. And so I ran the climate model for 2050 with CO2 levels projected for 2050 and other pollutants, gas and particle pollutants at 2050. And those are the results. You know, it's not clear that, you know, you'll get some shifts in locations of where you have strong winds and cloudiness, but it's, you know, it's not so great. You're not going to, like, the Great Plains is not going to no longer be the Saudi Arabia wind, as it's called, because, you know, you might shift where the winds occur, but you're not going to, like, they're not going to disappear. What does cause winds to disappear is more buildings. You know, more buildings will, you know, create friction that slows down winds. I did do another study that was kind of interesting recently, where I looked at the correlation between wind energy and building heat demand, and found that it, you know, in wintertime, like especially at high latitudes, when you have high demands for heat in buildings, winds are actually stronger at those high latitudes at the same time. So there's a very strong correlation between wind energy and heat demand, which is good for if you go to an entirely renewable system, because, you know, if you electrify all heating in the U.S., for example, heating demand is 4 times cooling demand in the annual average. So there's a big heat load. If you electrify all that heat load, well, first of all, if you use heat pumps, you're basically reducing that heat load by a factor of 4, because the heat pumps use much less energy than gas or electric resistance or oil. And so you do have less heat demand, but it's correlated, that heat demand in time is correlated with wind. So if you couple wind energy with supplying electricity for heat pumps, you can actually make a more efficient system in pretty much the whole world where there's high heat demand in winter.
So this brings to mind 2 questions that I've often thought about. Maybe you're an excellent person to ask these about. One is that when we do work with PV systems, we tend to think right now in terms of net metering, and as long as my system can, you know, meet the demands in one season and then, you know, be lacking in another season, but I make up for it with feedback from the grid, I'll be okay, I balance out. But when we electrify everything, if say the entire grid was to be based on solar, we might need twice as much solar in a winter time as we have, you know, need for in the summertime, and we'd overproduce. So as you've done these studies, have you found that that's a really critical reason why you're biasing a lot towards wind?
Well, you know, solar has become so cheap that you can actually double up your solar capacity and still be cheaper, the same cost as natural gas. So yeah, overbuilding, part of the solution to matching 100% renewables is overbuilding solar and wind in some places. And that's possible because it has come down in cost so much. Now, it's a trade-off between having more overbuilding and having more transmission. It's, in a lot of cases, it's actually easier and cheaper to build more wind and solar in a given location than to try to transmit the electricity over a long distance. Because, yeah, so, but these are, it's really an optimization problem in all the cases, in every location, every state, every country, of how much solar, wind, transmission, distribution, storage, demand response. Those are the components of keeping the grid reliable, and you're basically trying to optimize that. Not necessarily the least cost, but, you know, first of all, something that works, and it's something that works at low cost. And there are it turns out there are lots of solutions to it. There are a lot of ways to match that power demand with supply. Some of it involves overbuilding, some involves more storage, some involves more transmission distribution. There's not actually just one answer.
And so overproduction probably is more viable solution than seasonal storage. Because I know you showed some things with thermal seasonal storage, which is pretty exciting, but mostly works for heating situations. But I sometimes see people thinking in terms of, can't we store electricity for 6 months out of the year. And I don't think I've seen too many situations where that sounds very smart.
There's an exciting, sorry to interject, there's an exciting new technology developed in Alberta, which is kind of ironic, but it's called EVOR, and they're using the same technology from directional drilling that they use for fracking, but instead to create deep geothermal heat loops. And so it has a lot of potential for, in a sense, extracting energy and perhaps even storing energy at different depths. And so I know it's relatively new, but there is a pilot plant or pilot operation going in Germany, and so I guess solutions keep on coming up as we go forward.
Yeah, well, if I try to address the original question about do we need electricity storage seasonally, I mean, it's not clear that we do. I mean, first of all, there is some seasonal electricity storage, like hydropower is a battery basically, and that's, I mean, although it's continuously replenished, you're using it, you're not like storing it 6 months, you're kind of using it continuously. And the other option, hydrogen is not the most efficient used for electricity. However, there are some exceptions, like in a microgrid. Let's say you're in a remote Alaskan community or a remote Canadian community and you want a microgrid, you know, where it's three months of the year it's dark and maybe you can't have a huge wind turbine nearby. Having some hydrogen for producing both electricity and heat, you can store that hydrogen 6 months. It's just like, and if it's used in a fuel cell, that is. So that might be a use of hydrogen for electricity storage. But, you know, for large scale, you know, we found in our studies that it's, you know, you might want electricity storage for a few days or even a week or so, but we haven't really seen that it's necessary for 6 months, especially if you convert heating to heat pumps where things get more efficient and you reduce your variation in, and also, well, if you electrify more things, you have more flexible loads. Like right now, you can see big variations in demand for electricity, but if you electrified all vehicles, then you have that, you know, that's kind of a more regular demand during the year. And you then electrify all heating and for industry and for buildings. And you'll find that you have a lot more of what are called flexible loads. Like you don't need electricity immediately for hot water for your hot water tank. You don't need electricity immediately for your battery for your car. So those are flexible loads. So you can use demand response to shift times and peaks. So demand response is like battery storage. And we just found that we didn't have, except for hydroelectric dams, we didn't find you needed 6 months of electricity storage to satisfy demand on the grid with 100% renewables. It did help to have heat storage for long periods of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's kind of where it's going, because like up in Canada, we do have, 3 to 4 months of continuous cold weather and less solar resource and a bit more difficult to achieve all the demands at certain times of the year.
Yeah, well, in Canada, you have like huge amounts of wind and hydro too. Yeah, so.
In some areas, Alberta, we have hydro, but not a huge amount of hydro in Alberta particularly.
Anyway, yeah, you have good points in there, but it illustrates that, yeah, you've got to optimize for every region. What's the best solution? And fortunately, there are several possible solutions. You just have to kind of figure out what's going to work the best at a low cost.
Dr. Jacobson, we've reached the end of our time here. I want to thank everybody for coming. We have one more thing we want to share with you. Can everyone see that? So one of the things that we like to do here at the North County Climate Change Alliance is we purchased a tree for you in your honor. So it's something that you can look back on and remember the time that you spent with us helping to share your information and knowledge and really inspiration. We have a lot of different speakers come through and share knowledge with us, but you're giving us something else that I think some of the others are maybe not always able to give, which is real hope that I think of the climate mobilization here in San Diego, could probably say they're based all around your strategies for 100% renewable. So I just want you to understand that you've been a big inspiration to environmental groups here. You've given us something to point at and say, we have a solution, we have the target. So we really appreciate you coming and spending the time with us tonight.
Wow, well, this is a really nice gift. I really appreciate it, and hope this tree lasts for a long time. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and it's really great questions. And yeah, hopefully I was able to give some information that people weren't aware of before.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder, folks, we'll be sending out an email describing those links that Dr. Jacobson shared with us. And also we'll be sharing what our next presentation is. And this has been recorded, so watch for that too, because we'll be including a link. We'd like you to be able to share this information out to other folks, because this was a real hotbed of good information, and it's a shame if it only sits within this small circle. So please share it out to everybody that you know.
Mark, I just want to add, Mark, thank you to you and to Meryl, and also to Mark Jacobson, Carl. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Meryl, and thank you, Mark, so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's all
please post your slides on Twitter.
Yeah, if you're okay with sharing the slides, we'll do that too. You let us know whether you can do that or not.
Yeah, I can send you through Dropbox. I can send you the slides.
Excellent, thank you. And let's all unmute and give Dr. Jacobson a round of applause. Thank you, everybody.
Great job as well, Carl. Good job facilitating.
Yeah. Great job.
Okay, everybody. We'll see you.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll see you here next month.
All right.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Meryl.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.